All right, it looks like we have three judges. Can I get a confirmation from Judge Allen and Judge Rickley that you're both there?
Yep, here, Judge Allen.
Yes, here, Rectito. Yes.
Awesome. Okay. And it looks like we have our contestants as well. I say we get started. Do we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Looks like we're missing one, but that's fine. I assume that they're going to come in later. Armand, if you're ready, we can get started with you. Armand, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great.
I just want to confirm that everyone can see and hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Cool. I'll go ahead and type my title into the chat, and then we'll get started. So I'm Armin Bao, and the title of my speech is The Deal of a Lifetime. When I was a kid, there was one thing I loved more than anything else in the world. No, it wasn't G.I. Joe. No, it wasn't Barney. And believe it or not, it wasn't Hello Kitty either. I'm talking about discounts. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Look at this Indian kid on the screen talking about getting things for free. But what's faster than a speeding bullet? An Indian with a coupon. But my favorite type of discount? Buy one, get one free. Hear me out. What's better than one limited edition set of Diamond and Pearl Pokemon cards? Two limited edition sets of Diamond and Pearl Pokemon cards. I mean, I even bought 2 jugs of almonds at Target for that deal. Almonds. But can you blame me? That deal was just nuts. However, I've learned that just like me, our society has bought one item and unknowingly received many other items with it, all for free. I'm talking about what our food companies aren't telling us. Something so dangerous that it is poisoning our society. Across the board, we Americans have been over-consuming ultra-processed foods. Just like my unhealthy obsession with coupons, ultra-processed foods have permeated all parts of our society. And honestly, the reason is quite clear. When a normal person is in a crunch for quick and easy groceries, they almost always run to grab processed food. But what is ultra-processed food? According to the FDA, it can be almost anything. Cereal, granola bars, yogurt, even wheat bread. All processed foods, all filled to the brim with chemicals. One bite, even for the cleanest of purposes, and you're instantly filled with hundreds of dangerous chemicals and fats. But surely granola bars can't be that bad, right? Wrong. Unless it's a free sample from Costco. But contrary to what we think, those granola bars are a cocktail of calcium carbonate and high fructose corn syrup. The problem isn't that we're deliberately trying to eat unhealthily. No. Without us even realizing, food companies have been allowing us to put God knows what into our bodies. And that's my concern. I fear that 58% of Americans' calories, 580 million meals, come from ultra-processed foods every single day, skyrocketing obesity and diabetes rates, and costing our healthcare system billions of dollars. So today, let's first pick out our coupon and examine our society's obsession with ultra-processed foods. Second, let's walk up to the register and understand how our need for convenience has been exacerbating that addiction. And finally, we'll see if free food actually does taste better, testing our solution for success. But believe it or not, ultra-processed foods aren't just a problem for couch potatoes who surf Google looking for coupons all day. any normal person is susceptible to getting addicted, thanks to just how much of our diet is made up of ultra-processed foods. It's not just your cookies and candies of the world. It's your tomato sauce, veggie straws, and baked potatoes as well. So hello and welcome to the newest edition of Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Keeping Up with the Calories, where you can eat any food and leave with the prize. Drink a bottle of Gatorade, leave with a soup of chemically modified fatty oils. Eat a slice of white bread, leave with residual chemical bleach. Eat a box of Lucky Charms, leave, well, you're probably leaving in a coffin. But just like an Indian with a coupon, we keep coming back for more. But why do we keep eating these damaging foods? It's because processed food companies intentionally mislabel the amount of sodium, sugar, and chemicals in their foods. Soy sauce should be healthy, right? 300 grams of sodium. Low-fat strawberry yogurt, 30 grams of sugar. That's as much as a king-size Hershey's bar. But the worst of all, Coke Zero. Sure, its label might say that the drink has no added sugar, but that sugar is actually disguised under names like potassium citrate and phosphoric acid. If Coke Zero claims to be healthy with that much junk in it, then Jimmy Garoppolo is actually good at football. But when you're cracking open a bag of chips, at least you know what you're getting into. In this case, because of the intentional mislabeling of food, we're consuming a mixture of chemicals without even realizing it. And that's only because, just like the 49ers wide receivers, big companies have dropped the ball again and again. When will these companies stop prioritizing their wealth over our health? Sugar should be called sugar, not names that I find in my AP chemistry textbook. But why can't you just buy organic at the local farmer's market? Well, you can, but there are millions of Americans that aren't fortunate enough to have that privilege. Millions of lower income families are dependent on the cheap and accessible meals that food companies offer. While instant ramen might be an occasional snack for us, for many families, it's a constant. However, according to researchers at Baylor University, those who eat instant ramen are disproportionately more likely to suffer a heart attack or a stroke. However, lower income areas are considered food deserts because they have little access to affordable and healthy groceries. In fact, according to the Department of Agriculture, 1 million Californians live in food deserts and don't have a grocery store within 10 miles of them. And as a result, they're forced to turn to whatever will last, like ramen, cereal, and canned foods. Healthy, affordable food should be a right, not a privilege of the top 1%. And America is bearing the grave consequences of this eating. 71% of Americans, the population of 47 US states combined, surpassed the CDC's recommendation for the consumption of ultra-processed foods. That's 227 million people. 227 million people that have brought America's diabetes rate from less than 1% to more than 9% in just 50 years. 227 million people that have an increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of cancer, and frankly, an increased risk of death. And those numbers more than triple in low-income food deserts. Overconsumption of ultra-processed foods costs society $6.38 billion every single year. That's the equivalent of 23,000 luxury mansions all throughout Texas. So, to remedy our overconsumption of ultra-processed food, I advocate that the United States enact the following two-part legislation: mandate and modify, or the M&M plan for short. The first part would be mandate, where the federal government would mandate all processed food companies to label all their sugar, sodium, and additives into clearly consolidated categories. This would make it impossible to mislabel sodium or additives under the guise of more complex scientific compounds, so we actually know what we're getting into. The second part would be to modify, where the government would issue a $6.5 billion subsidy dedicated to encouraging grocers to establish additional stores throughout food deserts across the country. This would afford lower income families the access to healthy foods that they've been going without for years. This subsidy would be funded through this new $6.5 billion addition to the FDA's fiscal year 2022 budget and would pay for itself after only 1 year of existence. The Pan American Health Organization has already researched and promoted this specific type of legislation in Latin American countries. So if we apply this to America, we can successfully begin the fight back against overconsumption. So while my $1 almond jars might not have been all that, this new solution can be. Ultra-processed foods have been an inherent part of our society, but it's high time for us to change that, to prevent overconsumption rather than causing it, to put an end to processed food companies' free reign on America, to finally give Americans the deal of a lifetime. Thank you.
Hello, I believe it's my turn now, as second speaker. I'm Arnav Harsh. I'm just going to quickly put my title into the chat. And everybody can hear me okay, right? Okay. I'll start my time on my first word. I saw something last year that drew my eye the second that I looked at it. It was an ad displayed throughout the screens of the Great Mall. And then I realized, that's Gucci. A Gucci non-binary gender fluid advertisement. The irony, a seemingly female-based brand making clothing that blurred the lines between gender neutrality and gender separation. In the status quo, females, males, and other genders alike are constantly discriminated against based upon their clothing, facing over-amplified issues with dress codes, segregated clothing promotion, and dampening prejudice against LGBTQ communities who have no space in this gender-biased phonetic. So why am I, a male 15-year-old high school student, talking about sexism in today's society? As we've seen in the past, most of these advocates have mainly been women, such as Alice Wong, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and several others. The answer is fairly simple. There are simply not enough males talking about this pressing issue. So today, let's face the crowd as we confront the harms, unveil the definite causes behind this, and finally, address the solutions to this increasingly stigmatic issue. So for one, let's talk about dress codes. They were in fact introduced in 1969, over half a century prior when gender division was very prominent. Since then, the Atlantic Journal-Constitution states that 61% of middle schools and 56% of high schools report strict dress codes, which limit their freedoms of choice and expression. And this isn't even a minimal portion of the injustices that victims of sexism have to face in our society. Secondly, let's talk about the gender separation within stores. The highly regarded Vogue evaluated the binary men and women, and found that the current shopping system is outdated and exclusionary. And that is precisely what it is. Outdated and exclusionary. More often than not, we forget this simple phenomenon that occurs every single time we walk into a clothing store. Men on the left and females on the right. Split, divided, and separated for reasons of self-interest that seem hardly important when compared to the convoluted matter at hand. Well, speaking of the reasons, let's actually move into the causes of these stigmatic issues. For one, dress codes. As I've said, they were introduced 50 years ago when gender neutrality barely existed and gender separation was much more prominent. The Middle State, Tennessee states that the Supreme Court has never directly addressed school dress codes. In fact, in a 1969 trial, which involved high school students wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, the Supreme Court affirmed their right to the First Amendment of free speech, free choice, and free expression. But although this right was guaranteed to them, the Supreme Court never directly stated whether this right bars uniform clothing or grooming requirements. And this is additionally the first time we've gotten close to a judgment about school dress codes. This came about because administrators didn't even know, because their ideals were different and their disruptions of people's choice of clothing were all different. Many administrators don't even know what non-gender binary is. And it isn't their fault, but it comes from a lack of education, a lack of understanding, a sort of refusal, which translates into discrimination, stereotyping, and straight up denial of people's rights. Now, moving on to something as equally important, let's talk about the gender separation within clothing apparel stores. Clothing dictates what should be labeled male and female, said Lauren Libel, author and producer of a documentary We Exist, which promotes gender neutrality. Jewels, heels, and dresses for ladies, and suits, ties, and button-down t-shirts for the males. These aren't strict guidelines, but they are undoubtedly sartorial signposts. And it's these gender expectations that can make the shopping experience much more difficult for many personas, including LGBTQ personas. And the sole reason for this gender division split is money. Solely for the reason of gaining larger market shares by advocating clothing to specific genders. And it's these stereotypes that make people feel uncomfortable wearing unusual clothing in public or private vicinities, be it the mall, your home, or simply the clothing store itself. Now, there are obviously solutions to these problems. It's just that we've never really taken any action on them before. I might not be the first one to say this, but what we really need is government action. Action against these dress codes would coincide with our lives and prevent our freedoms of choice and expression. Action against these stores who directly split genders just to gain more money. And action to protect the LGBTQ communities who to this day have no rights. Without action, I'm afraid a simple speech will do nothing at all. And neither will the thousands of people who are currently trying to fight against the bonds of our society in hopes of building a better tomorrow. Okay, motivation speech aside, let's actually look at some of these solutions. For one, the United States Department of Education. As we've talked about, in public and private schools alike, children are faced with harsh dilemmas surrounding their clothing. The United States Department of Education can solve this by updating the guidelines that it sets for schools throughout America and set them to the standards of our new generation, with newer ideals that will lead to social progress and more relevant information that can be applied. Not only will this stop kids from being hindered the right to freedom of choice and expression, but also set new fabletics guidelines for schools throughout the United States of America. Now, for separated clothing within stores, we can look to the Federal Trade Commission, which manages the exportations and imports in and out of the United States of America. Through them, we can either completely remove these split up aisles of male and female, or create new ones for gender binary personas. Stores such as H&M have already implemented ideas like this, not only contributing to the solvency of these traditional gender expectations, but also minimizing the consciousness of self-consciousness that we have. Unfortunately, even if these decisions are put into progress, it still might take years to actually implement them. And that's why I'm here today, advocating for change in our society. A change that allows for the freedom of choice and expression throughout America. A choice that I believe soon many other countries will begin to follow. The issue regarding gender binary clothing is one that not many people actually acknowledge. But it's one that impacts our lives, and I mean all of our lives, every single day. So the next time you're about to buy those clothes and you're hesitating, just get them. Because there are no limits to self-expression. Just take those clothes, look towards the mirror, and smile. Thank you.
All right, is everyone ready? My title's in chat. All right. I think my sister is afraid of toasters. In her words, the toast just springs up out of nowhere. I haven't eaten toast in 7 long years. But while my sister no longer has to deal with her fear of toasters around the house anymore, I have to deal with my fears more than ever before. You see, I'm scared of injections. My dad would always tell me to look out the window, where I would see my favorite airplanes passing by. But during this blissful moment of my childhood, all of a sudden, ow! I felt a sharp pain in my arm. Yeah, it's safe to say I never trusted my dad ever again. But the thing is, the shots themselves never really hurt. Now, my dad's betrayal, on the other hand, that was a doozy. However, after spending hours and hours complaining to my parents about having to get a shot, I wasn't about to admit that they were right all along. So I did what any responsible teenager would do. I shrieked, cried, and slightly overreacted to a needle in my arm. Needless to say, I didn't like the doctor's office very much. But as it turns out, teenagers can be pretty selfish. I mean, who would have thought? I am very clearly the model child. And yet somehow, she's still the favorite. But hey, despite all my faults, at least I'm not afraid of toasters. But I never really stopped to think about how my actions, and yes, overreactions, affected the doctors who treated me. Because while dealing with a little kid who's afraid of shots isn't that big of a deal, doctors have much bigger problems. And that's exactly why we need to ensure that our doctors are properly protected. Because when the same people who dedicate their lives to taking care of us need help themselves, it's the least we can do. For most people, asking for help with mental health issues has fortunately become more and more normalized in society. And that's allowed so many people to regain full control of their lives. Yet, for some reason, this number excludes doctors across our nation. Some people tend to think that doctors can just take care of themselves. But while we like to think of doctors as superheroes, the reality is that doctors are human beings too. And this exact mindset is the same reason that the government hasn't stepped up to help them. So today, we'll first fill up our syringes with a deadly dose of reality as we understand why doctors often can't reach out for help with mental health issues. Then, we'll put on our gloves as we find out what happens when doctors are forced to deal with these issues all on their own, before finally administering a safe and painless shot by finding a solution to this problem. Many people think that doctors have the perfect lives, high salaries, fulfilling jobs, and tons of respect. Or at least, that's what my parents keep telling me. But the reality is just a little different. Because while doctors do enjoy these perks, they also have to deal with long and often unpredictable hours, the pressure of saving lives, and traumatizing patients, such as myself. But with all of this on their plate, it's only natural for doctors to have to deal with all kinds of mental health issues, whether they're mild or severe. But unlike the rest of us, doctors don't have the same access to treatment that we do. And the reason behind this lies in a 4-letter acronym, MLAQs, or Medical Licensure Application Questions. Wow, that was more complicated than my sister's fear of toasters. But these MLAQs often include unfairly vague questions about doctors' past mental health illnesses, such as, have you ever been treated for a mental health illness in the past? Doctors know that if they answer yes to this question, they run a high risk of losing their medical license altogether. In fact, studies show that the presence of generic MLAQs are directly correlated with doctors refusing to seek out help. Because in states with more fair and more specific questions, doctors are willing to seek out therapy. As a result, we see doctors all over the country being forced to deal with these issues on their own. And that's my concern. Because when the very people who spend their jobs and their lives saving hours need help themselves, but can't even reach out, who is going to do the same for them? Stress among medical professionals has spiked over the past half-century. The exceptional stress for being a physician is comparable to being a PTSD victim, with trauma stacked upon trauma. This puts medical professionals at a tremendous risk of suicide and even burnout. But what's worse is that these are the same doctors who feel like they can't reach out for help without losing their license. In fact, if you look at COVID, only 13% of doctors even reached out for help in the first place during the added stress of the pandemic. Picture this: hospitals overflowing, widespread panic, not enough supplies. Sounds scary? That was the living nightmare of thousands of doctors across the nation during the pandemic. But what scares me the most is that these doctors felt trapped and alone in these situations. Dr. Scott Jolly spent the pandemic working overtime to ensure that his patients got the help and the care that they needed. After exhausting hours, sleepless nights, and an unending amount of stress, Dr. Jolly was diagnosed with PTSD. However, in fear of losing his medical license, Dr. Jolly made his wife promise to keep it a secret, just so he could continue working the next day. Not even 2 weeks later, Dr. Jolly took his own life. His family feels that the medical profession failed a doctor who dedicated his life to saving the lives of others. And they are absolutely right, because Dr. Jolly was shot down repeatedly by hospital management when asking for help, knowing that there was nowhere else he could turn. And the sad reality is that Dr. Jolly is not an isolated story, but rather one of thousands of doctors all across America suffering from this flaw in our medical system. It's high time that we put an end to this injustice and make sure that our doctors have the same access to treatment that we do. Thus, I advocate that the United States federal government implement a nationwide regulation, forcing each and every state to modify their MLAQs so that they're no longer penalizing doctors for reaching out for help. Mayo Clinic professor Dr. Darabhai explains that the problem lies in how they ask. In some states, the question is really broad. Instead, she advocates for all states to ask a more specific question that assesses a doctor's ability to do their job, such as, are you currently suffering from any condition, mental or physical, that prevents you from doing your job? Now, if doctors are presented with this question, they know that they can simultaneously receive the help and the care that they need while also doing their jobs to the fullest extent that they can. Currently, the only reason the question is even asked in the first place is to ensure that those doctors who are unfit to practice medicine don't receive their license. But counterintuitively, this ends up affecting those doctors who are fit to practice medicine and do deserve their license. This change in the wording of the question would have been the difference between life and death for Dr. Jolly and so many more. Changing the state's medical licensure application questions has been long overdue, and it is finally time that the government steps up and acts. The government has unknowingly pushed doctors into silence for far too long. But now, with this national regulation, we can finally put an end to it. So yeah, maybe the next time I'm at the doctor's office getting a shot, I'll just grit my teeth and push through it. Because while it's okay for me to be scared of injections, and it's okay for my sister to be scared of toasters, it's not okay for us to let doctors be afraid for their lives while doing what they love. Thank you.
Hi, I'm the next speaker. Judges, can you see and hear me okay? Okay, sounds good. I think my speech should come with a content warning. There are some sensitive topics, including mental health and death. But other than that, I'm ready whenever you are. America, #1 country in the world. I'm sure anyone who has lived in the United States for long enough has heard that phrase, but when you think about it, what are we number one in? You see, the United States is number one in a mere 3 things, and one of those is having the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. We hold 25% of all of the world's inmates, despite only being a mere 5% of the population. Take a look into our prison system, and you will see young men and women being locked up and forgotten about, torn away from their families, losing all of their life's potential. The sick and the elderly, all alone, spending the time our society has deemed the golden years, in a place where proper food feels like a luxury. This is what over 2 million US inmates face on a daily basis. Despite government funding, proper staff and care are still a rarity within the prison system, hurting both current and past inmates. As of right now, the US prison system is highly flawed and negatively impacts inmates in virtually every aspect of their lives. In the short term, it does not care for the inmates' many needs during the incarceration period, including physical health, mental health, and rehabilitation. And in the long run, it often leaves these inmates unprepared to re-enter the real world, leading to reoffense and another round of incarceration. When examining the reasons for this, we can pinpoint 2 main issues. The first being a lack of rehabilitation, and the second being a lack of proper care. So today, let's first shine a light on the many issues plaguing the prison system and the negative effects they have on the inmates before locking up. The solutions that will ensure a brighter tomorrow. The first issue hurting US prisons is a lack of rehabilitation being provided for the inmates. The lock them up and throw away the key approach towards incarceration is clearly ineffective and cannot continue if we want to see positive change within our prisons. The United States has one of the longest average prison sentences at almost 12 years, yet due to the lack of rehabilitation being provided during the sentence, reoffense rates remain high. In fact, the United States stands out as a clear anomaly in rates of recidivism and incarceration in proportion to GDP. On the other hand, Western European nations, such as Norway, with similar government structures and economies, have a drastically different approach when it comes to incarceration. Findings from the National Bureau of Economic Research have found that the average prison sentence in Norway is just over 6 months, which pales in comparison to the US average. Research from the Coastal Carolina University shows that Norwegian prisons have a much more humane approach towards incarceration through their focuses on normalcy and work towards assimilating inmates back into their normal lives. All of this seems to be effective, as Norway has one of the lowest recidivism rates of any nation in the world, which is only half of the US average. Not only is rehabilitation a rarity, prisons also lack proper care for the inmates, leading to them suffering in a place where they're supposed to learn from their mistakes and recover. The current average age in prisons is still rising due to the length of average convictions, and with this rise comes a surge in health-related issues. The Marshall Project highlights that in the United States, over 40% of all inmates have chronic health conditions. Yet despite this reality, inmates have repeatedly voiced that their health needs were not met or that they were uninformed about certain medical procedures, such as vaccinations. Prisons are not always able to find enough medical staff or are unable to pull together the funds necessary to compete with hospital salaries. Studies from the University of Michigan emphasize that when it comes to female inmates in particular, gynecologists and obstetricians are usually unavailable, leading to the needs of these female inmates to be further neglected. New and expecting mothers suffer as well, as they're often torn away from their infants, leading to postpartum depression. And the current style of sentencing affects both the mother and the child. Postpartum depression, however, is not the only mental health concern within prisons. According to the Treatment Advocacy Center, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other serious mental illnesses run rampant within prisons, affecting 14.5% of all male prisoners and 31% of all female prisoners. Take Jeffrey Jurgens, for example, a 20-year-old who in July of 2019 ended up in a violent confrontation with the police. Jeffrey was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and was in and out of the prison system multiple times before this confrontation. Yet due to the fact that the system only focused on keeping Jeffrey locked up instead of providing him with the care and rehabilitation that he required, Jeffrey was never able to get better. And sadly, when it comes to inmates such as Jeffrey, who experience serious mental illness, there's an astronomically higher suicide rate. 15% for the average inmate, and a staggering 77% for an inmate experiencing serious mental illness due to improper psychiatric care. To approach the issues currently affecting the prison system, we must first start with the treatment of prisoners. It is vital that they are provided care and rehabilitation that prepares them for reintegration back into society. Not only that, but there must be an increase made in education as well. Results from both Stanford as well as the Coastal Carolina University shows that there is a correlation between education and incarceration. In fact, 68% of all male prisoners do not have a high school diploma, furthering this correlation between incarceration and a lack of education. Not only does education need to increase, but we must also make sure that inmates are able to find jobs as well. Take Finland, for example. While mandatory as well as vocational education are currently being provided for inmates, many have still reported that post-sentence life is tough due to the fact that they're not always able to find jobs again. By ensuring that inmates not only receive education, but help with starting their professional lives is the most effective way to lower recidivism rates. As of right now, programs are already in place to help people, such as Gerald Alvarez, a man who was newly released from prison and ready to start his post-sentence life. Gerald started out by making a mere $30 a day doing labor-intensive work. But through the help of a program called the Center for Employment Opportunities, or CEO for short, Gerald was able to find a much better paying job. Now, more than 8 years later, Gerald is a supervisor for a moving company and attributes much of his financial success to the program. By making these programs more widely available, we will effectively lower recidivism rates by keeping ex-felons out of prison and in well-paying jobs. To do all of this, I propose legislation in which career education and readiness is mandatory. Additionally, there must be an increase made in healthcare, including psychological attention, to fully ensure that these inmates are ready to return to their normal lives. To provide all these amenities for inmates, there must be an increase made in funding, as proper staffing and facilities are vital in creating a rehabilitative environment. While funding can come from a variety of places, one way to effectively allocate more funds to the treatment of prisoners is by shortening the length of average sentences. According to the Vera Institute of Justice, the current average cost per inmate in California is over $50,000. By shortening the length of average sentences, prisons will effectively have more funding to put towards the actual treatment of inmates. While the future for U.S. prisons may seem grim for the time being, with hard work and dedication, we too can care for the currently incarcerated, lower recidivism rates, help ex-inmates lead a better, brighter future. By lowering recidivism rates, we will bring down crime rates as well, bring positive change not just to the inmates, but to entire communities. And before we know it, we will make the United States #1 and something worth bragging about. It was Victor Hugo who once said, "He who opens a school door closes a prison."
Okay, I think I'm the next speaker. So I'll just put my speech title in the chat. Okay. Are the judges ready for me to begin? Yeah? Okay. I'll start my timer on my first word. It's the weekend and I've finally found some time to go shopping for some new clothes. I come across the most perfect shirt at a local boutique that I'd love to take home with me. But to my disappointment, I flip the price tag around and am immediately turned away by the $100 sign in small print. Defeated, I return the shirt to its place on the hanger and exit the store. A few shops later, I find a similar looking shirt at a larger name brand store. Flip the tag around and read $10. I'm confused. Do I go back and buy the $100 option? The obvious choice would be the $10 option, right? Well, not exactly. What if I knew that that shirt was the product of years of mistreatment, misogyny, and the exploitation of workers? Fast fashion is the creation, marketing, and selling of clothes that are mass-produced at a price accessible to the average consumer. These prices can range wildly, but mostly have to do with the way in which this clothing is made. And while clothing is a necessity, the Environmental Health Journal tells us that the average American throws away about 80 pounds of clothing annually, affirming the idea that too often clothing is treated as far more disposable than it should be. It's time that the fast fashion industry slowed down. So today, we'll examine the detrimental effects of fast fashion, its seen and unseen causes, and lastly, the legislation that will finally have us valuing workers and the planet. The first and most obvious effect of fast fashion is its damaging impact on the environment. But what we don't know is that CBS News quantifies that this industry creates 1.2 billion tons of greenhouse gases annually. This is 8% of all the emissions in the world. According to the UN, we have less than 10 years to prevent the irreversible effects of climate change. And with the fast fashion industry being such a large part of this, we cannot afford to be so wasteful. In addition to this irreversible climate change, the fast fashion industry actively encourages racism and sexism. Textile workers who are disproportionately women of color are forced to accept unacceptable working conditions worldwide. According to Labor Behind the Label, 80% of 74 million textile workers are women of color. These women endure harassment from their male employers and an overall lack of workplace rights. They expose that in Indonesia, the 6th largest textile producer in the world, women workers often report being sexually harassed by their male managers. And beyond this psychological and mental turmoil that these workers have to face, their working conditions, according to the Environmental Health Journal, are known to result in things like lung cancer, lung disease, and even adverse reproductive health, all of which damage the worker for life. We've seen the ugly harms of the fast fashion industry, so now it's time to take a trip through the decades to examine their causes. First and foremost, the Environmental Health Journal explains that clothing that is no longer wanted by the average consumer ends up getting either sent to landfills or getting exported abroad and dumped into lower income countries. For instance, according to CBS News, Ghana has over 15 million used garments imported on a weekly basis. The number one contributor is the US. Many of the local people in Ghana have tried to make a living out of selling this clothes, but what really ends up happening is a gross excess of material, which just ends up polluting their landfills, the ocean, and their environment. But it's crucial to remember that it's not just their environment, it's our environment. And especially when these things start polluting the ocean, when one part of the world is polluted, the whole world is. The second cause of the fast fashion industry goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, which became a standard for Western productivity, as we were able to have more than enough of seemingly anything we wanted. But underneath this feigned prosperity lay a more sinister foundation of exploited work. At the historical Lowell Mill textile factory in the 1840s, 75% of the textile workers were women. Foundations of Western culture affirms that even at this time, women would receive 1/3 of what men would earn for working in the same factories. And today, not only does this pay inequality exist, but textile workers take home mere cents for each piece that they painstakingly produce. According to the Garment Worker Center, 85% of garment workers today are paid 2 to 6 cents per piece, not to mention having to work in unsanitary conditions. It's abundantly clear that the same idea of exploitation sparked by the Industrial Revolution has carried on to the way that we pay workers today. The third cause is the gentrification of thrifting and its rise in popularity among the upper class. An example of this, as told by Vox, is sellers who buy clothing for cheap to sell them for an increased price point on online platforms. This leads to low-income shoppers not being able to afford or find clothing in their local shops, which increases the consumption of fast fashion, since price points at local thrift shops are increased in order to match the profit margins of online sellers. This means that people who are looking for inexpensive clothes tend to buy the less eco-friendly but cheaper fast fashion alternative, which ends up hurting everyone in the long run. The 2020 Fast Fashion Transparency Index reveals that only 2% of companies have explained plans to how they will solve for income compensation within the workers in their textile companies, meaning that these wages aren't currently a reality and that these companies have little to no plan on doing anything to improve the situation. It's clear that there's no solution placed to solve the issues that have been catalyzed by the industry. And so while proposing these solutions, it's imperative to remember that they don't have to be binary. We don't have to choose between paying workers mere cents an hour and completely leaving communities out of work. First, we must mandate that every company must pay workers a living wage appropriate for their location and agreed upon by local governments to ensure that these corporations follow these rules. Regulations exist today, but without the strict fining of these companies, this regulation is rendered ineffective. For example, the Chinese labor law states that workers can only work for 8 hours a day. But still, companies like Nike force their workers to work 11-hour days or else risk not being paid for their day of work. But if we're able to strictly fine these corporations that avoid these labor laws, we can help ensure that they don't do anything to bypass them. Next, it's necessary that we regulate the proper disposal and recycling of clothing so that an excess of clothing will no longer pollute our earth. For example, some brands like Patagonia have programs where they accept clothing to be recycled and reused and repurposed in their textile factories. But in order for this to work on the large scale, we need to implement programs that ensure there are places in every city to properly dispose of clothing, sending them to places where they can be recycled into new products. Lastly, we must make fair trade the standard to begin with. Fair trade products are products that have been recognized by the Fair Trade Organization to have been produced using labor that was properly compensated for, taking into account international working rights and conditions, which should be consistent with anything produced. If we're able to follow this 3-step plan, we can ensure that workers are properly compensated for their work and that pollution can decrease so that we are no longer wasting all of this clothing that we spend so much on every year, and that this clothing can be reused and repurposed into a way that's more sustainable. And if we're able to implement these solutions, this could finally be a reality. But the first and most important part in this journey is learning about it, because there is a large disparity between what actually goes on behind these factories and what we know as consumers. I remember going to the store and getting excited when I would read that a product had been made in Indonesia. I would try to play a scavenger hunt game where I could list as many countries as I could find on each tag. It was a subtle stamp of recognition that something had made its way to the States, and it was something familiar and interesting to me. But what I was completely oblivious to were the countless environmental implications, the misogyny, and even the racism that a simple garment could be complicit in. Where I saw a scavenger hunt or a tag, I didn't see what countless other workers saw, which were the real stories of women who were paid almost nothing to be harassed in a nightmarish environment. Fast fashion exploits workers and the earth. But if we're able to implement these solutions, we'll finally be able to counter these practices that so inaccurately portray our hopes for the world. Because exploitation has never been, and shouldn't be, in style.
Hi, judges. My name is Ahilan, and I'm the sixth speaker on Taboo. I can go whenever you guys are ready. If you could just let me know. I can't see you guys, so if you guys could verbally just let me know because I'm using the back-facing cameras.
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Okay. And
Me
would it be
too.
okay if I use timer to time myself?
Yes, it should be fine. Yes.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. I was officially a grown-up. 10 years old. It was on one of those evenings that I did something truly astounding. By stacking 3 Oreos on top of each other, I had transformed the culinary experience forever. And obviously, my 5-year-old brother, like all younger brothers, had to copy what I had just done. I was immediately frustrated and used my newfound adulthood to tell him how utterly wrong he was. How could he copy my unique invention? But don't worry, I've moved past this age. Now we argue about copying each other's taste in music. But sibling rivalry isn't the only thing that prevents the flow of ideas. Unfortunately, today's patent system in America is surprisingly similar. Ideally, patents should encourage innovation and create an equal playing field for small innovators and big businesses. But realistically, the current system discourages innovation and gives an unfair advantage to the wealthy corporations. Simply put, restrictions created by patents restrict the flow of ideas. So today, let's see how the system hinders innovation, especially for the poor, and come up with a solution to build a more efficient and equitable patent system. The concept of the modern patent, first adopted in 1787 under a provision in the Constitution, gave and protected the intellectual rights of authors and inventors. Patents were required to be new, useful, and non-obvious. And today, people can apply to get patent protection to the United States Patent and Trademark Office, known as the USPTO. But the first problem originates from the limited patent requirements. The US has one of the broadest definitions of what is patentable. Today, processes, machines, articles of manufacture, and compositions of matter are patentable, creating over 650,000 patent applications every year. And although patents are legally supposed to be unique, these terms are not enforced properly. According to Forbes, 30 to 40% of patents are invalid or low quality. And the first effect of this large number of invalid patents is the very limited time patent examiners can spend on each patent. On average, patent examiners can only spend 12 to 16 hours on each patent. 12 to 16 hours reading complex diagrams and scientific research, which increases the likelihood that more useless patents are approved. And the opposite is true as well. With less time on each application, there's also a higher chance a patent examiner rejects a good, if not great, idea. Yet, even with that time constraint, according to the United States Patent Office, it takes about 2 years to get a patent approved. And people, especially those of low income, are reliant upon these patent applications to move up the social ladder, either due to a business idea or a scientific invention. Oh, and if you pay around double the original cost, you'll be eligible for Track 1, a system that approves patents in a year. And while this option may seem harmless, it actually makes it worse for lower income people, as they cannot pay this hefty fee while rich corporations can. Although a person may have invented first, if a corporation gets their patent approved first through an option like Track 1, they have legally stolen the intellectual rights. Additionally, companies abuse this vague enforcement of the requirements. The USPTO says that 50% of those 650,000 applications are from corporations like Samsung, Toyota, and Intel. Companies like these have applied for useless patents simply because they have enough money. If a patent is rejected, they can always refile until it gets approved. By racking up these patents, they have a safeguard against any litigation brought against them. Say Samsung decides to sue Apple. Apple can pull up all the patents they have, and because they have so many, choose one that Samsung has violated. Using this patent, Apple can file back against Samsung, and they're protected. Because of these vague patent definitions, the patent system is always overloaded with broad patent applications, and true innovations are forced to wait longer with a higher possibility of rejection. But in addition to patent racking, there are patent trolls. These companies obtain vague patents solely to sue companies using these patents. I know, a shocking resemblance to my 10-year-old self, but this actually happens. According to the Harvard Business Review, the total estimated cost of defense against litigation because of patent trolls was $29 billion per year. And the loss of firm wealth due to these patent trolls was an astounding $60 billion. One company called Lloyd's, that neither makes nor sells any actual product, claimed that it had rights to the in-app purchasing technology that's used on smartphones, suing over 11 different corporations. Our lenient enforcement of patent laws breeds loopholes that patent trolls can use to intimidate and threaten smaller companies. And this brings me to the second reason why patents have caused more harm than good. While patents are supposed to promote the exchange of ideas, patents often complicate the use of others' inventions. Every idea, innovation, invention, and creation was built upon previous ideas. Mark Twain put it best when he said, "There is no such thing as a new idea. We simply take a lot of old ideas and put them into a sort of mental kaleidoscope." Thomas Edison is unanimously known for creating the light bulb, but he never created the light bulb. He built on the previous idea, made it safer and more efficient. Steve Jobs didn't create a new cellular phone. He took the best of the phones around him and designed the iPhone. And this is the essence of why patents hinder ideas. The vast number of useless patents, coupled with difficulty in using other people's patents, creates difficulty in expanding upon previous ideas, in turn hindering innovation. And the effects of this are especially seen in the medical industry. Patents have been a significant factor for the high cost of medical prescriptions, due to the royalties placed on medical ideas. And these restrictions have extended into the pandemic we live in today. COVID-19 shook the entire world last year, forcing scientists around the world to find a vaccine to help prevent fatalities. And they did. Thanks to groundbreaking research, most, if not all Americans have access to vaccines like Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. However, 85% of vaccinated people live in high to middle income countries like the US. And one significant contributor to this large discrepancy between the poor and the rich is due to patents. Last May, President Biden finally agreed to support the suspension of patents to help other countries have easier access to vaccine technology. But until that initiative, patents had largely restricted the reproduction of vaccines in many third world countries. But we can solve this problem. My proposed solution comes in the Patent Requirement Act with two main sections. First, the USPTO will increase the requirements for patent applications, ensuring that new applications are unique and useful. Consequently, unnecessary patents, like my Oreo tower, won't clog the system. Secondly, we must factor in the socioeconomic background of the applicant when determining the cost of the patent. And as a result, large corporations with excess money to spend won't be able to get unnecessary patents for cheap, and will also allow low-income people to apply for patents with less economic burden. So yeah, maybe my brother can copy me because my Oreo tower wasn't really a groundbreaking idea. And just maybe, my brother will be able to stack 4. And similarly, patents are essential to giving ownership of the right ideas to people, regardless of their financial or household status. We must ensure that patents are accessible and accomplish their goal of promoting innovation for everyone.
Hi, are you able to see and hear me okay? Great. I'm the 7th speaker, Nihal Kanda. I'll put the title of my speech in the chat for reference as well. But the title of my speech is I'm Just a Kid. And whenever all the judges are ready, I can begin. Okay. Is everyone ready? Great. I'll begin. Life as a teenager in America is really rough. Sitting bored at home, having a limited phone battery, not finding a girlfriend, it can't get much worse than that. Well, my parents seem to think otherwise. Whenever I bring up my unbearable struggles to them, they always say the same exact thing. You kids have it easy, you'll never understand the struggles of our childhood in India. And my parents' childhood stories are interesting. From having to cook and do the laundry since 3rd grade, to walking 5 miles to get to school every single day. Now, while my parents may be exaggerating at times, I couldn't imagine growing up in India. Many kids in India have to go looking for food to get through one more day, or work in their family shops so they can make a living. Meanwhile, kids in America just watch TV and play video games. We actually have it pretty easy. But this isn't always the case. Now, when I was younger, my greatest worry was finishing my homework. But for hundreds of thousands of children in the US, their greatest worry is standing in scorching heat for hours every single day. Their greatest worry is using dangerous machinery like chainsaws and tractors. Their greatest worry is working on America's farms. Our country's laws allow kids as young as 8 years old to die working in the fields from horrible conditions, cancerous pesticides, and dangerous farming tools. So today, let's first uncover the unseen epidemic of child labor on US farms. Next, we'll explore farm labor's devastating impact on children. And finally, we'll come up with a solution to put an end to America's agricultural child labor once and for all. Wake up at 5 in the morning, collect your hats, your gloves, and jump into the white van waiting outside to take you to work. And spend a grueling 12 hours on the tobacco fields. This is the daily routine for 12-year-old Yesenia Corello, a young girl working on farms in North Carolina with her 2 younger sisters. But wait a minute. The United States is the epitome of human rights, where child labor is supposed to be a thing of the past, right? Wrong. The Department of Labor finds that 500,000 children in America, like Yesenia, are victims of unregulated farm labor. Now, to put this into context, child labor was rampant in America in the early 20th century, till the 1930s gave way to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The act was intended to improve working conditions through new practices. Now, the Fair Labor Standards Act largely increased child labor regulations across the board, except for the agriculture industry, where there isn't even a minimum age required to work on the fields, despite it being the most dangerous industry to work in. For one simple reason. Farmers were using children to make a profit. And our government has tried to overturn these outdated exemptions, but gave in to the interests of farmers and lawmakers who believe child labor is the rural way of life. Our country has prioritized making money over saving children's lives. And these children are forced to leave school to work on farms, trying to help support their families, but they're not even paid minimum wage, leaving them in a cycle of poverty. According to Human Rights Watch, youth farm workers drop out of school at 4 times the national dropout rate to get paid a mere $4 an hour. Instead of going to school, having opportunities, and getting a new life for their families in the future, these kids are literally worked to their death, spending 72-hour work weeks in 100-degree weather, filled with dehydration and heat strokes. Now, you would think these kids would have simple duties, like feeding the chicken or milking cows. But instead, they have to use dangerous farming tools, like knives, chainsaws, and tractors, with little safety training. Marcos, a 12-year-old boy, had to operate a chainsaw without ever being asked his age on the farm. When Human Rights Watch asked if he was ever taught how to use it, all he said was, "You just have to start it. That's the most important thing." All the while, Marcos had to use his chainsaw for hours in the fields, with pesticides being blown directly in his face. Beyond just working with dangerous farming tools, child laborers have to deal with complacent farm owners spraying chemicals right in front of them. And this is a story for most child laborers, having to work barefoot in the fields for 12 hours every single day without even simple protective equipment like gloves or masks. According to estimates from the Environmental Protection Agency, there are up to 3,000 reported cases of child farm workers being exposed to pesticides every single year. And many more cases go unreported. Since children don't even have simple safety training, this leads to loss of consciousness, coma, and death. These are children who should be making friends. These are children who should be going to school. These are children who should be playing in fields, not dying in them. 33 kids get injured working on US farms every single day. More US child laborers die in agriculture than in any other industry. This complete disregard for these kids' lives stems from a quest to get the job done as quick as possible with no breaks, regardless of colds, flus, or illnesses, rain or shine, bedridden or not. Walter, a 17-year-old boy working on farms in North Carolina, paints this picture when he says, "I don't know what hurts the worst. My legs hurt. My head hurts from the sun. Today I've had 3 nosebleeds. after spending the entire day on tobacco fields. Agricultural child labor is entirely unregulated, leaving kids to hospital beds and caskets. While farmers use child labor to try and make a quick buck, hundreds of thousands of children are paying the price for it. Michael Young, a 15-year-old boy living in Western Kentucky. Now, Michael was an agricultural child laborer from a very young age, spending the days on the fields instead of hanging out with friends or going to school. On one summer day, Michael had the job of helping with managing the grain with no supervision, till he fell into a truckload of grain sinking in like quicksand. Everyone watched helplessly as Michael sunk into the grain, and in the blink of an eye, his life was taken away. He was just a kid. Salvador Velasquez, a 10-year-old boy living in Florida. Salvador was also an agricultural child laborer from a very young age. At just 10 years old, Salvador had the job of driving the farm's pickup truck without even a license. In the farm's orange grove, Salvador had to drive the truck forward with a trailer to fill. But as he was pulling the truck forward, he ran over his 2-year-old brother, Ruben. And Ruben's life was instantly gone as soon as the trailer rolled over him. All because Salvador, a 10-year-old child laborer, was forced to drive a pickup truck. And it cost his brother's life. He was just a kid. We get food on our tables from children working in the fields, and we stand idly by as they're dying because of it. They're just kids. It's time we take a stand. The Fair Labor Standards Act currently exempts the agriculture industry from all regulations, allowing children to work in the fields. So I advocate that the United States federal government enact the following two-part legislation to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act. First, the government should increase the minimum working age for farms to 18 years old and enforce this requirement, thereby eliminating child labor throughout the United States. And second, the government should provide monetary incentives to families to alleviate their financial hardship, so they don't have to rely on their children's wages and kids can finally go to school. According to Furio Rosati, writing for IZA World of Labor, financial incentives have been given to families in many countries, such as Ecuador and Morocco, which decrease child labor and increase school attendance. As described by the First Focus Campaign for Children, this proposal is supported by many experts, such as Congressional Representative Lucille Allard. Allard advocates for a parallel proposal, closing exemptions in current legislation that allow child labor by finally imposing regulations on the agriculture industry. And with that, you would have a world where 8-year-old kids aren't being forced to work on farms, and children can finally live happy lives. By fixing America's child labor laws, we give a chance to children like Michael Young, Ruben Velasquez, and the hundreds of thousands of other kids chained to America's farms. It's time we take action, because these children deserve to live. After all, they're just kids. Thank you so much.
Great work, everybody. Good luck on the rest of the tournament.
Good luck, all.
Thank you for judging.
Thank you, judges.
Thank
Thank you so much for judging.